Hey guys, thanks very much for coming. Can you all hear me alright?
Yeah.
Cool. If you're up the back and you can't, just do this because I'm pretty softly spoken. This is an unusual talk for me. I usually give quite technical talks. But what I really wanted to do today was talk about some fairly technical concepts in a way to just kind of bring them all back to reality and really demystify what's going on and try and give everybody a sort of shared understanding of the vision that I think we're all working towards really, but the one that I'm sort of particularly focused on. And this is me, for those that don't know me, I'm Pospi. Most of the place on the internet. My real name's Sam, but no one really calls me that, and those are my details. And a little bit of background, I have mostly been in supply chain provenance related things in the blockchain space. My previous job was at the Ledger with the diamond industry there. And I've spent a little bit of time on the Vine team, but I've sort of been skipping in and out working on other applications with Vine. So without further ado, let's cut into what we're here for. I'm going to use this quote of Amanda's. Is Amanda in the room, by the way? No. Damn. She said in this article, Let's Build a New Internet, which I think was some time ago when that one was published. Value is captured in as many dimensions as reality. The representation of value that exists on the virtual plane becomes so rich with data that virtual becomes flush with real. And the point I really want to stress in that is that first sentence. Value is captured in as many dimensions as reality. And I think that's really important what we're doing because value is a very nuanced and very complicated thing. And we don't all value the same things to the same degree, and even we have different values about the same sorts of things. So just some sort of examples of things that are valuable to us, the goods that we buy, the products that we buy and create, the physical assets that we use to build more stuff, and of course money, tokens, shares in businesses and projects. Our time, of course, is probably our most valuable asset. Ideas, designs that we sort of formalize with those ideas, and even our social capital is quite valuable in this day and age. And I really want to sort of mention web of value here as a concept, because that term's been thrown around in relation to blockchain, but really only because it features currency. And when you just fixate on currency, all that other stuff is gone. You lose all that complexity and the thinking value. What you're thinking about actually are the things that don't really have any value in themselves. They're just the things that are abstract that we say have value. And sort of beyond value, this is another quote, and this is quite more recently from that wonderful article in the New York Times. As Stephen said, we spent our first years online in a world defined by open protocols and intellectual commons. We spent the second phase in a world increasingly dominated by closed architectures and proprietary databases. We have learned enough from this history to support the hypothesis that open works better than closed, at least where base layer issues are concerned. And I just kind of wanted to highlight this tension between open versus closed. And what it's really about is it's about creating network effects and how we build up networks. And I think history tells us, and what this article alludes to, is that closed networks usually die. And they die because they don't connect to anything, so there's limited usefulness, or at least usefulness that's limited to a very small group of people. And the internet, I guess, is the hallmark of how open really works to scale into networks to become dominant things. And there's all those. And there's all those closed networks that were there at the beginning of the internet as experiments. And can you tell me any of them? Not gonna. Except maybe AOL. It's kind of a joke. And they died out for a reason. And so there's sort of two ways to create these network effects. You can go with openness, or you can go with dominance, like Facebook or Google. And the problem with dominance, of course, is that it leads to centralization, unequal power dynamics in the system, and corruption. And beyond that, it also leads to resistance. And I have vivid memories of a former startup that I helped to found where we went and implemented Facebook login, and I just hated that process. I really didn't want to do it. And then we launched the site, and we had a good percentage of people, 15 to 20, coming back saying, I don't want to sign up for your website because I have to use Facebook. I thought Facebook's not there. and this is obviously not a healthy relationship to have with the networks that we connect with. And I'll also say that more value is unlocked when networks connect. When more information connects to more information, we see more and more value becoming available to everyone in the network. And I also want to sort of highlight this base layer issues as a concept, because when we're talking about base layers, we're sort of talking about those things that we take for granted that society just runs on, that are sort of everywhere and implicit, and you just accept that they're there. And so in this new web of value or internet of value, whatever the media wants to call it, it makes sense that new base layers will emerge. So let's just sort of solidify that a bit and talk about, let's give some examples of base layers. So the roads, to me, are a base layer. The from city to city and moving stuff around if they weren't there. The telephone lines that carry all the signals that we use to talk and send data across the internet. The protocols that we build on top of those to just move bits around through the lines. And then on top of those protocols, we build in things to represent documents so that we can send more useful data to us across these lines. And there are sort of extra standards, extra base layers that we put on top of HTML to make the web more easily digestible by machines. It's sort of just kind of trying to take things that we make to documents and make them a little bit machine friendly. And even more kind of modern API, machine-to-machine sort of stuff, SOAP and REST and Swagger and GraphQL and all that stuff. It's still really just documents under the hood. And the point I want to make about this is that all of these base layers are all built on top of each other. And all the base layers become foundational for newer base layers as the society we live in increases in complexity. And so with blockchain, we have this new complexity, and so we have these new base layers. And we don't really yet know what they're going to look like, but we can think about what we might like them to achieve. So here's some things we might like them to achieve. In terms of the socioeconomic fabric of our society, we would probably like to unlock barriers to the flow of value. And I'm stealing Steve Alexander's words for this here. And what we mean by that is that all forms of value are treated equally, and it's up to the users to decide what they value. Which may seem a little abstract at the moment, but we'll kind of dive into that later. And what this kind of really means is that all these different types of value that I was talking about before, we need to be able to sort of liquidly exchange between all those kinds of value. We'd like to solve the rigidity of the current day economy, which I guess is sort of an extension of the prior point that really in this day and age you need money to do anything. And if you don't have any money, then you're locked out of all the other kinds of value. You can't do anything really without something paid that people will. And we'd like economic activity to be possible in the absence of money. And so for those of you who are familiar with Sweetbridge, their liquidity protocol is sort of one way of achieving that, because you can basically, with what they're doing, take a physical asset and turn it into tokens and use that as money. But for me, this is sort of skirting around the issue because it may perhaps be better and smoother to take out that intermediary step and avoid the need for those tokens at all in the first place. Maybe that might not work in every case, but I think in a good number of cases it could. So we'd like to be able to start work without any capital, even if you don't have any assets, if you just want to start hacking away at computers at the library. We'd like to be able to reward effort that people put into projects without needing any capital up front to do that. As in, we don't want to have to bankroll pay people. And we'd like to, I guess the point of it all is that lifting people out of poverty isn't going to be about giving them value. It's going to be about enabling them to utilize the value that they already have. And so beyond that, we would like to make open collaboration profitable and incentivize people to do good. When I spoke to my advisors about that sentence, they weren't too happy with the word profitable, because open collaboration should generally sort of be more about the joy of creating and making things better. But we've all got to eat, and so there's sort of a necessary reward that you need to set up for these things to want people to contribute. And so, open source work kind of does this naturally. And I think, an important part of this is that when you're talking about incentivizing collaboration, the process to decide how the income from any project should be shared needs to be done democratically. I suppose that's the caveat to the profitable part, is let's make the profit sort of equally decided. and it sort of all stems, I guess, from this, I think, fairly widely well-accepted human ideal that people should be rewarded in proportion to the contribution they make towards things. And of course, we'd also like to, improve the means by which the world runs, make things more ethical, make things more sustainable, perhaps even reverse some of the catastrophe of climate change. And I think this has been said many times, and I've certainly, I know Vitalik talks about it a fair bit, that really the point of the theory is that we're trying to stop global warming and reverse climate change and fix all the problems of the planet. And I think we're all kind of here for those reasons mostly. So then, beyond socio-economic goals, there's also some technical goals with what we might want to see in new economy. And again, with the unlocking barriers to the flow of data is just as important as unlocking barriers to the flow of value, because, and especially now, data and value are interlinked, and we already kind of know that our data has value, and that's why Facebook is free, and Google is free, and all that stuff. But we want to know more about the value, we want that richness to be maintained, which means that we need more data about what that value represents. And equal access, of course, to that data is very important, because that means equal opportunity and empowerment to anyone who has access to the system. And we would like to represent any economic system in a consistent way. And if we can do that, then we can reduce the effort of connecting all the networks up and all the silos and all the platforms, because we won't have to spend time as developers translating between different protocols. And we'll be able to allow all blockchains to play together, which means that we won't be wasting effort, all the energy and time that we'll put into Hyperledger and streaming and Tangle and all the IOTA, all those things that are already happening. And beyond that, I think a lot of the focus in interoperability today is focused on blockchain to blockchain, but it would be ideal if we could have the blockchains talking not only to themselves and other blockchains, but also to systems that will come beyond what blockchains do now and to the old internet and client server systems and people's Drupal instances. So that's a bit of, I hope, grounding as to why we want to do all these things. So let's move on to how. So these base layers that I sort of spoke about earlier, they're actually, another word for them would be protocols. And even the roads, there's a protocol involved there as to whether you drive on the left or the right, and how wide your car is allowed to be, and all these things that are needed for the whole system to function. And protocols, it's a techie word, but they're just agreements about how we communicate. And language, me talking to you now, is just another protocol that we've all kind of agreed this is how we talk to each other. And so, we might call them APIs from time to time, we might call them interfaces, we might call them ontologies or grammars, but it's all the same thing. It's all just words. And the thing to remember, I guess, in all terminology is that computers are really just there to help us communicate and coordinate. So they do that by communicating and coordinating automatically on their behalf, so it's like we have to give them all the language to do the job before we let them go off and do it by themselves. And something else that's sort of important is that changing protocols once they've been decided upon is very costly. This is a photo of Sweden, Stockholm, I think, on H-Day, which is 3rd September '67, when they decided that they were going to change which side of the road that everyone drove on. And this day of complete and total chaos, and maybe a few ensuing days when all the people who live in rural get anyway. So naming things is what gives us those protocols, and naming things is hugely important. In fact, it's often referred to as the hardest problem in computer science, and this joke has been done to death, and there's a million variants. And the reason people think of it that way is that naming things requires a deep and careful thought about how we want them to be used, because the wording that we use influences the way we're going to deal with that as it's sort of handed across the table to us. So as a programmer, you really have to predict and design the intended repercussions of your actions as you're coding. And again, naming things really directly influences how we interact with them. So let's just get a bit more concrete, a bit of an example on that. These are Facebook Open Graph tags, which any one of you who's done a bit of SEO or had to edit some content on a WordPress blog might have tinkered with. And you can see here, we've sort of got title and image. There's also a type here, which it used to be very restrictive. You could only say that something was a website or an article or a place or a product or a profile, I think. And that was all that was possible to sort of describe to Facebook back in the day. And they've since kind of blown that wide open, and now type can be basically whatever you want it to be. You just have to tell Facebook what type of things you're going to be doing first. So it's sort of, they've expanded the scope of what you can describe to them, and the reasons for doing that, and the reasons even for defining this protocol in the first place, is that it was intended to allow Facebook to crawl all across the web and build up a database of all the content that was out there online, essentially extending their market dominance over the internet as a whole and making a pretty little previews not in the newsfeed, and that was really what it was for. So that was the power that naming things in this way afforded to Facebook, and the dominance that they exerted, the network effects they could create, basically meant these ended up all across the internet, and people really couldn't bother dealing with anyone else's little annoying tags. So now other apps like Slack, for example, also scrape these when they look through websites because they also want some of that power. So there's this sort of tension between monopoly and open, where they actually call this the Open Graph Protocol, but it's not really open at all. It's just feeding stuff into the Facebook machine. So I guess the sort of summary of what I'm saying with all this is that naming things gives them great power, and with great power comes great responsibility. So let's talk about what's new now in the web of value, as we call it, and how do we name things. Which base layers do we need, if we want to put it that way, to achieve all these sort of egalitarian goals that we talked about before, unlock those barriers to the flow of value and data, and enable greater economic participation, leave everyone as sort of equals within that network. So finance is the obvious base layer. Most blockchains have it. And when you're talking about finance and blockchains, you've basically got tokens, which are things like Bitcoin and Ether, Litecoin and an ERC20 token. You've got transactions, which are just the things that we do to move tokens around, really. And you've got accounts, which can be humans or organizations or autonomous agents. And there are things which do movement, which send transactions. So this is finance as sort of we understand in the blockchain space. And there's also a kind of gold rush at the moment on supply chain, and particularly provenance of goods and tracking where things come from. And here's some of the companies that are working on that stuff. Knowing that I couldn't find a good way to apply it since I got the crystal clear copy sent to me, so apologies to the buying team for that. But there's this gold rush going on at the moment, and these are just a few that I managed to find logos for off the top of my head. There are dozens and dozens, and they're all doing basically the same thing. Because an obvious application of this new ledger we have once you've got finance is, okay, let's just track all the things and just record all that. So that's what lots of people are doing at the moment. And in supply chain provenance, we basically talk about assets, which are the things we produce. We talk about actions, which are just the things that happen to the assets in the course of them being produced and sold to you and shipped to your door. And we talk about actors, which are the things, again, people, companies, autonomous agents that do the happening, that move those assets around and perform actions on them. So provenance is basically, in its essence, about tracking the attributes of assets as they change via actions initiated by actors. And all the companies that I mentioned before, they all use actually the exact same data model, with slightly different names. So, I think actually Composer and Client both call them assets. Composer calls things participants instead of actors. Some things say like events or transactions instead of actions. So there's variation, but it's all the same stuff. And so there is a protocol for supply chain provenance just begging to be brought out here and defined and made whole, so that all these different supply chain provenance solutions that we have in the blockchain space can all work together as one. So what we're seeing, I guess, is that provenance is becoming a base layer for this new internet as well as finance. And so let's go a bit deeper and think about what is common between supply chain provenance and finance. So you've got, I should have animated, this has been converted from Google Slides. You've got transactions and actions, and they sort of seem common to both, and in fact, in terms of Ethereum, they're pretty well identical. If you're updating something in client, you're sending an action as a transaction to the blockchain, so it's basically the same thing. But the issue that I sort of take with transactions is it has a sort of financial implication. And action too sort of has this agency issue where it implies that the blockchain made the thing happen. And of course that's not what happens. The world does stuff and the blockchain records it as a record. So it's not the origin, which is sort of what action applies to. And I think it seems like nitpicking, but I think it's an important point because it's important that we really retain the humanity of these things as we go and bring them into the blockchain. We don't want it to sort of become this reality we live in where the blockchain is this domineering force that runs the world and we all just kind of bow to it. It doesn't take control of that. So let's use a more generic word here that implies that the ledger is just a record of things that have happened. And so we can call both of these things events. And now, whether you're in provenance or finance, these are just things that happened. So we've sort of made that a bit simpler. And in terms of accounts and actors, well, they're both just people and organizations. There's nothing really different about them. So let's just go with a word that's a bit more general for them and something that maybe leaves it a little bit open to other things that might change stuff later that we haven't thought of yet. So we call these agents. And they're things that we call them agents because they're things that can make choices. They have agency of their own. And so that just leaves tokens and assets. And a token might be an asset. Like you could move money through a supply chain if you wanted to, and maybe with Sweet Week you can move tokens representing an asset through in whole or in part. But not always, and probably even not terribly often. It's not likely. But you could do it. So is there kind of anything common between them? And the answer is yes. And what's common is that they're both valuable. They're both things that have value. So, but again, like transactions, what we're talking about with tokens, it's kind of fintech talk, and assets. Assets is kind of an awkward name because it's more used to describe the things, the tools that we use to produce things. And I know that Sweetbridge talks about assets in their protocol. So we've got Sweetbridge talking about assets as the productive assets, and Vine talking about assets as the produced assets. And so there's going to be a difficulty in marrying those two terms when we come to sort of joining these systems later, which seems likely because they're both dealing with supply chain. So in terms of a more generic name for both these things, we might, I'm just going to go ahead and say, we're going to call them resources. And resources is nice because it's just a little bit more generic name and it lets us more readily include things like environmental resources and these questions that we're thinking about. So now what we have is resources and events and agents, which can describe all of these things that are common between supply chain and finance. And this is actually the official ontology for the ISO for accounting systems since about 2002. It's how they describe all kind of accounting stuff that they do. And it's also the grammar on which we model open value networks. And we call it a higher order abstraction. And the reason that we call it that is that because it's more abstract, it can describe more things. And so that now means that you can treat finance and product as the same, and in fact all its components, physical assets, shares, time, ideas, design, social capital, we can treat all of that the same within these systems. They're all resources. So what we've done here is we've unlocked the ability to exchange value in all its forms. And in fact, we can, as I said, we can include things in this now that we hadn't so readily included in our economic model before. So yeah, the barrier between things and effort and money is all kind of gone if we talk about things in these more high-level concepts. This is just the tip of the iceberg. So this is a model of a grammar called value flows, which you can find in this URL, which is sort of born out of the REA grammar and ontology. And it adds a whole bunch of stuff to do with the planning of things and commitment to work and grouping events and planning processes. It lets you do some really cool stuff. You can define what they call value equations to sort of comb over a graph and look at all the contributions and automatically pay people. You can build algorithms using supply and demand signals to avoid overproduction and underproduction, what they call mutual coordination systems. And just as a sort of example of that, Dell, they originally made everything to order, and so there was this kind of flowing of product through their system. And then at some point they wanted to kind of be able to respond quickly to orders, so they started to hold inventory, And that causes bottlenecks in the process, and they end up sort of pushing that need down further the supply chain, saying, okay, we want to inventory, now you guys have to, and you guys have to. And as they did that, more and more friction built up in the supply chain until the process kind of became inefficient. And when you have a system that can describe the flow of value in a very abstract sense in terms of variable products and inputs and outputs in your supply chain, let's write algorithms where you can actually detect these bottlenecks and work to fix them. And so yeah, this value flow standard is sort of, it's an REA-based standard. It's sort of still evolving, everything is, but it's stable enough for use. And it's basically an economically focused system. There's other people thinking kind of further beyond. There's a guy, Greg Castle, who's working on something he calls the modular organization terminology, which is again based on the REA model, but he wants to be able to relate economic possibilities to other psychological and social phenomena. So he's thinking a bit further ahead. His stuff is maybe a little bit too unstable to really delve into practical implementation yet. So I just kind of want to say with that this is all a journey and not a destination. And the journey starts actually, these are a few friends of mine. The guy in the blue here is Bill McCarthy, who I know the Vine team have been in touch with him and his cohort Grant Gold, talking about these grammars. And so he's sort of been developing this model since the the early 80s. Born out of computerized accounting systems. I don't know if anyone here is familiar with enterprise resource planning software that has a lot of applicability in that area. So I just kind of want to say that there's been a big kind of corporate backing to this stuff, and there's even now an REA ISO blockchain being developed by some people. So it's not just for open value networks. This kind of grammar can be used to describe all kinds of systems and allow us to sort of integrate them all into more connected ecosystems and networks. So the other two in this photo, here they are again. This is Bob Halligan and Lynn Foster, second and third from the right there. And this is them with a group called Sensorica. And Bob and Lynn sort of got involved with them after meeting Billy Graham, and they started a company called Mycorrhizal Software, spent a lot of time working on sort of local economic empowerment, several open supply chain projects under their belt. And then they got involved with Sensorica, who are an open hardware organization. Sensorica basically pioneered this open value network concept in a big sort of distributed company and trying to make it scale. So they do all their work through this system, which is a Drupal system, which is showing its age now. It's got about 30 years of code history under it. And if you look at this TED talk, he goes into the sort of full history of it and their reasons and their outcomes and what they found to be really challenging about it. So it's quite well. So beyond that, I kind of just wrap up by sort of outlining where I'm heading with all this thinking. It's been a bit of a long journey. I've sort of started down this path of research about 18 months or a couple of years ago even. And I think where we are now with blockchain is a very interesting but very scary time, because when you sort of think about it, we used to do computers like this back in the day, and so you had your IBM mainframes and smart people and businesses with lots of money built boxes and put them in their basements, and this is how they sort of ran the world. And we moved on from there through the 80s and 90s, and we had personal computers and laptops and phones, and so the boxes kind of came to infiltrate reality more and more, and now we're kind of more beholden to how all the technology around us works. But actually it's all still running in data centers like this. We're still running the world much the same way that we did, where we've got big companies with lots of money running big data centers that are crunching away and running society. And where we're at now, to me, looks more like this. I actually kind of wanted a picture of the world in a box, because that's what it feels like to me, but this is close enough. So it's, now that we have a global singleton computer, what we've really done is taken the machines out of those basements and just built an entirely planetary operating system. And what was it that someone said before? Social and economic operating system. So I just kind of want to say that to sort of bring the gravity of where we're at with this. We are building an operating system for the planet And the feedback loops and the mechanisms that we put in place with that and the values that we build into it are very strongly going to affect the future of this planet, whether or not we'll survive. So Rosa and myself have been, there's a story behind this spoke. We're sort of rebranding now and branching out from our prior case study. But we call it Project Basel because we're really looking at a substrate for the new global economy. And what we'd like to see with that is that all supply chain provenance systems are integrated from the enterprise all the way down to the hyperlocal. So it should be as easy for IBM to prove the provenance of all their computer parts and how they were made as it is for me with some spare eggs in the back to go out and sell at the local market and prove that I fed my chickens on milk. We need all those systems to be able to work together so that we can unlock all these barriers to value and data, so we can actually have more visibility and more control as to where things come from and how we buy and sell. We'd like to see servers and blockchains and beyond all integrated and working together, networks of networks. Basically, let's work on protocols that can connect up this ecosystem that we're creating, which is still kind of a bit over the place, and make it all work together as one, and do it with the least amount of technical effort possible. Let's have a marketplace where all the negative externalities that are visible, that happen in the production process, are visible at the time of sale. So let's have an eBay where you can see on the side, this much carbon was burnt, this much water happened, this much nitrate went off into the soil, all that kind of stuff. This is how the workers were paid. And let's have something that enables us to be continuously improving the way we do things, so that we're not stuck with kind of tired, outmoded production practices that are, kind of inefficient and cause a lot of wastage. Let's continue working to improve those. And so let's incentivize people to collaborate on open designs and open hardware, something like that happen. And basically, let's have a global marketplace that fosters community resilience and heals the environment. And the sort of connection there is that a lot of what is inefficient and environmentally destructive about the way the world works at the moment is that things aren't done locally. And you think about how many tons of carbon it takes to fly a bunch of vegetables from the Netherlands to Singapore, so people there can eat it. And they do it for 9% of their fruit and veg. So if they'd be growing it next door, then a very different story and very much more robust system. And I just kind of want to, this is just a diagram I threw together this morning, which is a continually evolving thing. And I just kind of wanted to point out some things about it. And this is my kind of current thinking as to how this new economy is working and where all these base layers sit and lie. So I sort of put provenance front and center because that's my background, that's what I'm familiar with, so this is kind of in the epicenter of the things I research. But also I think it's probably the most important thing we have because all the things that we produce and buy and sell are feeding into that network. So, and I've listed hyperlocal right there because we're the guys who are working on the protocols to how to describe that more generally. We're not working on application-specific stuff, we're working on this is how supply chain works, and if you want to make your supply chain transparent, use one of these protocols and there you go. Productive assets I've sort of put over to the side here, along with this global knowledge commons. And the arrow feeds both ways here because the things that we use to produce other things are of course created in themselves. So there's a provenance that goes into the way that the harvester was built, or the way the tractor is made, or the way the laptop that I'm using is built, which does have some small impact to how efficient and the things you can produce with it. So if you can use less water or less carbon dioxide in the first place, then you're a better foundation than you would be if you're using something that's less ethically produced. And the blueprints for the way we make them, this continuous improvement cycle here that I'm talking about with green, is hugely important for efficiency and sustainability. And of course those two things are linked. If things are more efficient, depending on how you describe efficiency, they're often more sustainable as well, just because you're using less stuff for the same reason. I have a good sweep bridge here, which would sort of pull assets back to finance. But this is sort of an option too to close that loop. Verification down the bottom here. Internet of Things and sensory verification, I think is very important for this sort of cycle. There's a Len Schrader who works at ConsenSys Labs who's working on Internet of Things enabled farming equipment. So we're sort of hoping to use her as a case study for this kind of stuff, so that we can have, you know, the sensor equipment prove and do it using some of these protocols here, prove in a way that's incorruptible that the way she's growing stuff actually lives up to the hype that she's putting on and the claim how water is used, how ethical it was, and that sort of thing. And then this can feed into a provenance system and then eventually show up in a market somewhere where all that data is visible. And so really talking about empowering the consumer to be aware of how the production process works. And something I'll also sort of say about this sensory stuff is one way, the human sort of verification is another way. And again, you can be verifying that the way things are produced works. You can be verifying if philanthropic efforts have been done correctly. And I think that's really a missing feature of all the provenance systems that I've seen built and designed, and the ones I've worked on, is that they're mostly targeted at the enterprise who's doing the producing themselves, which is very good for efficiency and authenticity. You know, those are things that the enterprise can prove in of itself. But when it comes to efficacy, you're just taking their word for it, and it's very little different to having a blockchain say they said something was not GMO, and having a sticker on something that they bought a certification that said it's not GMO. I haven't really listed governance here. I put organizational governance here because mutual coordination efforts do sort of play into how we will organise our work and collaborate together. The governance is sort of a much broader thing. It's less like a base layer and more like an internal library of the systems in use. They're all going to need governance of some sort. And the stuff that Nick Dodson's been playing with, where sort of John, the story, and I are working on DAOs for land governance of communities, and then we've got governance for more general purpose governance structures that we understand as people. And Nick's now saying multi-sig is kind of this ultimate abstraction that you can describe everything in terms of. So I'm not quite across that yet, but it's interesting to me. But I think these four systems here, verification, provenance, and assets and governance, if we can get all those four tightly integrated, it really gives us everything we need to build an open value network, build something that does all the things that I've kind of been describing. The rest around here is all kind of great, it'd be nice to have it. Things like impact enablement, I don't know if any of you saw Regen Networks talk at DevCon, but they're kind of thinking maybe beyond impact incentivization, which is where everybody is at. And of course, we can do things, we can use what they call a lifecycle database that has sort of known baseline of this is how much water energy it takes to produce a ton of steel. And then if you can beat that, then maybe we can reward people with carbon credits for that work. So you join together the provenance and the impact incentivization perhaps. But these guys are thinking sort of beyond that in terms of, well, we really need to have the carbon credits at all. We can't just build a system to let someone pay someone with the other side of the world to build an engine. That's what we want to do. So that one's kind of maybe more about philanthropy and verification at the same time. But it was interesting to put there as a mention anyway. So there's a few things on here I haven't shown. I thought this was a good way to end because it just kind of lays out some thinking and maybe creates a little debate. I know we've got a fair bit of time left. I really got through it a bit faster than I was aiming to. So I'm very interested to hear what other base layers people are thinking of in their own group and how they see it integrating with all these systems that we're kind of thinking about designing. Because yeah, this is really the planetary OS is what we're in it, and so what APIs, what systems, what protocols can we design that the best outside the sort of so it's the end for me. Yeah, thanks. Who wants to talk to me about stuff?
What's missing?
What's missing? I put down registries. I think is a big one. I don't really know if registries fits into all this, maybe in the supporting role. Identity, for sure, and there's things like verification. If this is going to be a thing, then identity probably needs to underpin that to some degree. And reputation, I guess, is part of that as well. You need identity and reputation. So, those are the other ones that I'd sort of fall at the top end, but I know there's more. Yeah.
So one thing I've been thinking about recently is like how can we communicate and get other people who are not in the big space to collaborate on what this vision is and what we want to accomplish. Because I see this as a big problem that like we who are in the tech space like are building this stuff without having a dialogue with the people outside.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. I think communication is definitely a big one. I experience a lot of frustration when you go to someone's ICO website, you read their thing, and you're like, no one who's in crypto would understand anything about what you just said. It's all buzzwords kind of thing. So I think good communication skills are definitely needed in the industry. Beyond that, I think having real case studies is very important. Actually being able to go to people who are on the ground doing the work and saying, what are you doing, how can we help? And trying to sort of, get them across these concepts and help them think about how they might apply them to what they're doing. There's always going to be that discussion of, how do you want to do things? Okay, that's awesome, but like, I want to talk to this other thing somehow and explain the benefits as to why that's good for them as well. Interesting.
So,
I was just gonna say, I thought like the concept of being able to see kind of externalities that go into production, but like, how do you imagine? It seems like I guess like for saying we're not working with people outside the tech space, like how do you imagine eventually getting critical mass to do that?
The previous case study we had, we'd go under the name Share Farmers, and they were working on food production, and they sort of had a few supply chains set up for distribution. So that was a good one for me to attack initially because it's the bottom of the supply chain, food is what we obviously depend on from there. And I think if you can get a big enough case study to make big enough press waves to show what that impact is happening, then you can kind of send a platform from there and get other people on board. And also then we've also worked out the kinks of that pilot study, so that's good as well. That's a simple question, sorry.
No, I was just wondering, like, it sounds awesome. Like, I think if you're an ethical consumer, you want that, but maybe I view the world as not wanting to be, like, we're trying to be transparent, right? Like, that's what we imagine people want to do, but it seems tough.
Yeah, for sure. The other side, one of the big things for me about this, I was talking about value equations earlier as being this way that you can do work without any money, decide on how your contribution reward's going to be. It's basically the same thing for qualitative, and then just have it flow through when income does come in. And I think in the same way, like what I would really like to see is just let people fight about it on social media, right? Like have the marketplace, have all the quantitative measures recorded, so it's just, years of water, this much electricity and solar generated between whatever it was. And then have people use that same idea of value equation to define, whatever they want to see as a economic score of several indicators of like, this is what efficacy means to me personally. And then have those as links that you can share on Facebook and go like, here's my idea of what an ethical economy is, and someone can take that and bring it to and say, oh, making the environment more important and opportunity to do something and change things up. Just because the biggest thing I think about everything we do is that if we're making decisions on behalf of our users while we're building a platform, we're kind of fail. Unfortunately, I would say always the harder way wrong. So I think it's all going to be democratically decided and really come from people's own values. It's just about a difficult line of how you build tools to do that without telling people what to do.
I just want to remember that it helped me get some of it outside of scope and not too much. Just recently has been formed ConsenSys, it's called ConsenSys Solutions. It's a circle that contains about 8 people. And the main mission of the ConsenSys Solutions is to take products of the solutions of consensus, like this one, ideas to the market. And that's we're a global organization. We are basically a bunch of business development people who can communicate to the market the value proposition that you guys are creating. So come to us, come to talk to me, the Economies. There is Mono based in London, there is Pretty was based in San Francisco. Phenomenal people, very open. We understand what ConsenSys is all about, what we're creating, and we are the people who are taking this to market, either enterprises or or to some sort of social NGOs, governments, you name it. We have people that focus on the niche specifically for your product. So come to us.
I really like the way you framed the vision. It's like helping people create value with the stuff that they already have. And so much of what's possible there is based on things that are already democratic, things that are in our heads, particularly brand value. The things that people are governing in these colonies and these swarms, whatever, like there's some income stream coming in for some reason. And a lot of what people are talking about is coordinating work on these platforms. But I think most of what that stuff is going to be used for is coordinating brands. Because the value is all imaginary, it's all already in our heads, it's all already democratic. And the missing piece in this for me is like the people who are actually going to design the brands that people are creating value for. It's very democratic. And if we find ways to do that better, people can create value with the value they already create by saying this is a brand new.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So you're talking on the mutual coordination side in terms of, and you make a group, and like this is organized, and you create a group, and then these are our values, this is how we work, and people then buy in because of that value system. So this,
right, like either not even just value about how things are created, but values about what I'm gonna how I want that value to be used. Because right now the value that accrues to brands in our society goes to whoever owns that intellectual property. But we're creating it. It's us. Whenever you say I'm loyal to this brand, you create value for somebody else. But if you can democratically allocate that value, you would be able to coordinate value that you create. I have no money about this, but I have brand loyalty. I should be able to decide where that value goes.
So this is a bit of a huge question, but so much of this, and especially when you're building or trying to rebuild economies, I'm thinking of areas that don't have formalized economies, their economy and economic development is highly contextual. And so how do you translate this, time and time again, pretty much exponentially, because every, sub-community has their own value understanding and form of an economy. So looking at this giant map, how do we, not necessarily scale it, but how do we bring it down to the ground level?
Great question. I think it's all about having a protocol that is abstract enough that you can sort of define anything you want, and this is a protocol that's really been from the get-go created to enable diversity. That's sort of the purpose of it. Everything that you model in an REA-based system, it's always a resource that's being manipulated at some point to the up or down road by an actor kind of thing. And whether it's a local let's economy or a non-cash system or a local financial system, they can all fit into those models. It's like the way that I got into all this was sitting down and just throwing away all assumptions and going, what would I like the economy to look like, and designed the entire thing from start to finish. And did that, and then went online looking for people doing similar things and found these guys, and it was like, everything that I've described, I could pull it apart or describe it the way that they've described it, and actually I get to find a single economic system that doesn't fit into another model. So I think that's where power comes from. It's just having something abstract enough to encapsulate that diversity.
Yeah, I think that point is really helpful. That's something that I was thinking about that I liked about the presentation, like when you were referencing supply chain versus finance, and in either of those cases, resources and like the environment wasn't really captured within supply chain, wasn't really captured within finance, but when you abstract enough to resources, all of a sudden the environment becomes like a category that is included in. I guess I'm curious, like the only question that I have about that is, like, I think there's a lot of misallocations of value, like within just like the world, right? Like when people think of resources that they can easily take for granted, they may not. It may be easier to represent it at a lower value point. So like, how do you deal with that when it's hard to?
I'll send you a link after this. There was a great case study that there's a website, locicon.org, I think. It's like local economic development experiments and stuff. But there was a case study using open value networks to do with a terrible American geography, like in the north and the southwest of Canada somewhere. And they had a lot of trawler fishing there and also some fly fishing. And so there's a lot of quality issues with trawler fishing because the catch all gets like shredded up as they drag it across the ocean. But the fly fishing is kind of being phased out by the trawlers. And so they did a couple of analyses of this supply chain and how the trawler fishing looked and how the fly fishing looked, and how many, square miles, or I don't know how big these things are, I can't remember, but how much of that habitat was being eroded by trawler fishing versus fly fishing, and you can actually model that as a resource and say that you've lost 10 hectares this year because you've done this much fishing, and so then you end up with whether it's you want to hope that you're doing all your research right to make sure it's accurately modelled, but having something at the end of the day where you can actually see that if I buy this many fish, I'm hurting this many square feet of ocean.
That requires like that actor to feel ownership for that resource that they're affecting. But it doesn't account for totally externalized shared resources, right?
So you've got things like bringing impact incentivization where you can make the supplier pay. It's sort of in the same way that street footage to me feels like this gateway drug into not caring about value in terms of money anymore. Carbon credits and there's a group of the Global 4C Foundation that are all about taxing pollutants and stuff like that. And so you just turn the problem back into a financial problem, which I think gets us there. It helps people make that transition, but it doesn't actually get us thinking about what is equity. And that's kind of the end game for me. So you're right, like someone who's not a consumer might look at it and go, yeah, okay, I don't care about 10 feet of ocean, that's fine, I buy the fish, but that's kind of their decision to make at the end of the day, and it's just about how do we educate them better so that they don't make that decision that way anymore. I hope.
Yeah, and then we said we have a transparent supply chain. You could put some ethics back on this and say like, well, at least you can see.
Sure. And you can see that they want that too, right? So you're like, good job, so find a fish. And their neighbours going to shake
It's a funny marriage between. I've heard some people kind of critical of these heavily blockchain supply chain things because like it could be like a gateway to a huge surveillance state, right? And in some ways, it totally is. It's like a radical openness. Like if you show all your cards, though, like you're open to total streaming, but maybe that's good behavior.
Yeah, I used to be a privacy activist. Actually did some campaigning in Australia with data retention, and my feelings on the surveillance state have always been, well, it just depends who owns the data at the end of the day, right? Like if we all surveil ourselves and we own the data, then we're kind of in a much better place than you own the data, hopefully.
I mean, I was thinking, some of my own ideas, but the blockchain space is creating this global computer, but I think a lot of the utility will be very different. So, let's think about something like tax. The issue with tax, people wanting to avoid tax, is often they don't see the impact that the money that they would give provides, and tax is really important, obviously. So, if we can restructure things much more locally, where let's say a group of friends go out to dinner and everyone has food, and the first time I'm like, sorry, I forgot my wallet at home. Your friends would probably cover you. If you do that another 10 times, they would be like, yo, like, what's up? I don't want to eat with you anymore. Like, I think that's going to be similar on a local scale where it's like, yo, you're living here, you're not contributing to the roads and healthcare, and it'll start to become like a local system based on a global system. But I think that openness is only useful for those smaller systems. I think globally the whole surveillance thing is less, it's not what we want, obviously. You don't want a central power looking at all of the data.
What about a decentral power?
Exactly. But that's also a problem. It's where we sort of draw the boundaries of these economies. Let's say a group of 100 people have their own supply chain amongst them. And maybe that shouldn't be shared, so it'll be.
Yeah, maybe. I'll definitely go for that. But I guess the thing for me is that we produce everything globally now, and so it's not going to get us very far if only local economies are trying to do things better. They need visibility over the stuff they import that's manufactured in China and assembled in America and shipped to Australia kind of thing. They need to be able to see that because that's part of their economy too. They hopefully we can wean them off it maybe over the long term, but for a long time at least, we're still going to be buying Dell laptops. So, Samsung phones and stuff.
Yeah, sure.
Related to taxes, like how much does the payment protocol level affect, like in fact, the actual value of what comes out?
This is, if I'm understanding your question correctly, I think not very much, but it's still a problem for me, and this is why I'm occasionally critical of blockchains, because when you have a base economy that's a scarcity-based economy, so it's just like the money we have today, there's a finite amount and we'll kind of want some. And on top of that, we're paying transaction fees to miners. So those are the two cases where I'd say that the economy is inextricably linked to to all this value data we're putting on top that can't separate it, because if you want to just record that you moved the product from A to B, you're going to have to pay a few cents or a few dollars depending on how underloaded the network is to be able to change the data. So there's a project called HoloChain that I've been quite interested in, where they're doing a totally different kind of consensus, but they're working to get away from those two things. Like we don't need global state anymore, and we don't need miners. And so transaction fees is kind of what they're aiming for. So I'd like to see some state channels and things that can integrate between Ethereum and HoloChain, but it's a way off. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I was also thinking like interledger, like just the metadata on that level, and then all that like you can really feed into a different value network and all that stuff.
Yeah, totally. But then Interledger take the transaction fee as well, right? So everyone needs to have their systems paid for it at the end of the day. So the more that we can self-own the systems, the less transaction fees we have to pay.
What was the name of the chain you just mentioned?
HoloChain.
Holo.
HoloChain.
Do you feel like some part of this graph is not getting enough development attention?
I do feel as though this one is not kind of getting that much attention. There's a few people working on it. Streamer is a platform for sensory data and analysis and stuff. And that's what the region network guys are partnered with to use their part. But yeah, no one's really trying to work so much on closing the feedback loop and making the means of production better. There's a documentary called POP21, POC, Proof of Concept, and it's, if you watch that, they're basically the people that I want to build a system like this for, like a bunch of open hardware that's trying to make sustainable systems and doing it bottom up. And they call it POP21 as a bit of a fuck you to the COP21 in Paris summit. They had it at the same time. So while everyone's in Paris doing the UN and trying to fix the world top down, and that's what we have to do. It's just, I made a wig van, it costs $30, it's $7 bucks, I have to have it. Yeah.
So what are the next steps to getting this thing off the ground?
More case studies, definitely. Just trying to find people that we can partner with to be more tangible in what we're doing. But beyond that, I kind of see this as an iterative process of just me donating my time where I can. I've sort of spoken to Sarah Mills and Design Stoke a little bit about it. They want to have a more reusable UI kit library. There's a project called the Open App Ecosystem, which the Inspire Foundation started, which is on that front to create UI components for people to just be able to experiment wildly with and networks really fast. So I think those kinds of components, building out this stuff, because this is a platform, this is probably the protocol I want to use for it. And there's not really anyone there who's done an open source sort of publicly available version of something like that, where you can just connect IoT sensors to something that can spew out data that doesn't get tampered with. And on the On the verification side, I haven't really delved into IXO protocol yet, but that's those guys that are building that for human sort of validation claims. And the project that we started with WWF, of course, is really on the similar front. There's no such thing as too much innovation, and something. There's this lady, Sandy Metz, who's a big hero of mine. Says a lot of stuff about code architecture, and she talks about you've got to be able to tolerate the duplication first, and then you can find ultimate abstraction later. And duplication is far cheaper than wrong abstraction, is what she says. So if you reach for that too early, you end up with something that doesn't quite fit the problem, and then you just try and make it fit it more, and you waste your time doing this awful coding break. And I think, there's been so much experimentation with provenance, and I've seen it from so many angles now. I'm pretty convinced that we can do this now. I've seen all the duplication, it's all pretty well the same. So,
And do you need help? Do you need help?
Yeah, sure.
There's a room full of people that might be able to help.
Can you elaborate more on the philanthropy piece and the thought behind that? Because I know in development thinking, like the end goal is ultimately to move away from philanthropy and from NGOs and from feeder kind of organizations and to create like self-sufficient entities.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the goal. The reason I put it in there is the gifting economy as a concept, that's sort of the thing that people talk about. And I think there's an extra kind of level that you could add to a marketplace if you treated donation the same as products within that marketplace. So that I could say, like, I'm selling this product and I'm also going to give this much money to someone, or buy them a new harvester, keep using farming equipment because that's been doing for the last 6 months. But I just sort of put it in there as something to think about on that front, and whether that's useful long term, probably not, but in the short term, probably helps to utilize some resources. And this Alice seems pretty standard in terms of charity. This one, the Give team, the concept that we give a pledge on, which is basically the same thing as like democracy. I think that's a really interesting idea to basically allow anyone to be philanthropic and donate money. As much money you don't have to do with it, but you know how to do stuff, you take it and pass it on. That was what I was thinking.
So where can we learn more? How can we?
There's a lot of information on the Peer-to-Peer Foundation website. I can give you a link. This GitHub project, has a bit of a history and stuff, but Django we are at. And this is a fork of Sensorica's platform that a group in Europe called Freedom Co. for their work coordination and reward stuff. And they've integrated it with their Faircoin blockchain, which is an interesting experiment. That's a long tangent.
What is this for you?
This is an open value network implemented as a Django website, basically. So it's mainly about work coordination and processes and exchanges and stuff. Basically, just lets them track all the stuff going on in the organization, and all this kind of stuff do work without money and get rewarded later.
You should present this to the DMNT team.
I've been thinking about it because it's since it comes from it's utilized in ERP and it could work very well in sort of organizational resource planning. They call this OCP, well, there's so many acronyms exist, but the platform that this front end was built for is called OCP, for Online Collaboration Platform, which was a fork of Sensorica's software, which they called NRP, and they called it that for network resource planning. So the exact same stuff as ERP, but to work beyond the bounds of the organization and talk to other organizations is the one. And I think their original kind of vision back in the early 90s was for something more like structured semantic data on web pages, where you can just kind of be scraping each other's economic data off the page and making those offers and things like that.
Are you scared that a sustainability voluntary work will get
deter people from getting into the system because then the city is not accountable for work and some people are done.
Oh, this is quite the opposite. This is having an enormous amount of accountability for work, so that we can all, so that you, as a community, can all agree that it's fair that you get paid as much, because then you can look at the account later and say, like, look, I did all this work.
Yeah, so it's not. I mean, it's not like you do whatever you want.
Well, yeah, sure, but if you do whatever you want and it doesn't get used by anyone else, it's not going to be worth much because you won't make any money from it, I suppose. Cool. Good drive.
There? I will do that.